And then of course it does this. No, it's at the very bottom one. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Morning Forum at First Unitarian Society in Milwaukee. Let me begin by just a little note about masks. We have a change in our process today at the church, and due to the city announcements of less contagion, we've made the decision that masks are a little more optional rather than required, especially in small groups like we are considered. So if you decide not to wear a mask, that's your decision. If you would like someone near you to wear a mask, please ask them, and we ask that you honor that request. So that's where we're at this juncture of masks. So thank you. Before we begin today, I'd like to bring to your attention, next Sunday, November 13th, our forum will be, can a lawsuit against CIA affect the US attempt to extradite Assange? And that's with Ann Batista, our host. And now today, I welcome Kristen Becker up here, our host today, and he's going to introduce our speaker, Peter Isely, and welcome. Welcome, Peter.
Closer. So we should be up. Sorry. Welcome to the Sunday Morning Forum. For 3 decades, today's speaker, Peter Isely, has been working on behalf of victims of clergy sexual abuse. This year, his organization, Nate's Mission, filed 45 complaints with the district attorney about cover-ups by the Catholic and Green Bay Archdiocese. He personally took grievance petitions to the Vatican. Maybe he'll tell us more about that. Today we'll be focusing primarily on the Catholic Church, but please understand that clergy sexual abuse is a worldwide concern that has even impacted our denomination. It's a heavy topic, so I'll begin with something light. I still remember something Peter said in his last appearance with us several years ago. He said that we are all sexual beings and that we can't totally repress these thoughts from our consciousness. My spouse and I attend many comedy shows, and we sometimes get picked on by the comics who want to know if we are still sexually active. I tell them I practice safe sex. I put all my sexual urges in a safe many years ago, and now I've forgotten the combination. Today's speaker, Peter Isely, has not forgotten the combination as to how to give a effective and a compassionate speech. Please welcome Peter Isely.
Well, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I remember being here a few years ago, and it's been 30 years since I came forward publicly about this. So it's been 3 decades. So this is since this month, November 12th. And so this is kind of quite personal for me. And I feel very grateful to have this chance for you to welcome me into your congregation, because so many survivors and victims of clergy sexual abuse, at least in the Catholic Church, but other churches too, denominations, are really not welcome. They're only welcome if they talk a certain way or not talk at all, really. That's a very sad thing after 30 years, that I really have not been able to be in a Catholic congregation. So you're going to get to hear a presentation that, if I ever get to see the Pope, this is what I want to. And we've gotten close, by the way, to that meeting with him, that moral conversation with him, but it still has to happen. I remember here being there years ago, and it's like, I noticed there's a few less people in the seats, so I'm wondering what happened over the past few years. But I like how, like Catholics, like hardly anybody sits in the front row. So that's a good, there's a combination that we have. So I want to kind of give a biblical reflection, actually, which is unusual for me. And so I'm going to just take this opportunity just to talk about the Bible, talk about Christianity and what it means to me, what it means to survivors. Because that's an unusual kind of thing to hear from survivors. You probably see us when on television, activism, what we're doing. We don't get a chance really to talk about that, talk about our faith, which is what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about my faith and what I've learned from literally thousands of victims of clergy sexual assault and rape from around the world, everywhere around the world. And I've had the opportunity to be with my fellow survivors, working with them, organizing them around the planet over the last 30 years. So that's what I want to share with you. And thank you. I just want to say one more thing before I start. So I'll be about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And then I'm going to introduce Sarah Pearson. We're going to show a short film about what's happening right now in Wisconsin. So it's like a 10-minute thing, which is, I think, will be really interesting for everybody about, okay, let's sort of come down to where the situation is here in our community right now with this. And then we'll take questions. So, and I mentioned too that when I came forward 30 years ago, the first group of survivors here publicly, that there were two congregations that welcomed us. One was Plymouth Church over by UWM, Pastor Mary Ann Nebel. Her husband was my philosophy professor at UWM. They welcomed us in. We had our first press conference there. And they got a lot of blowback for that. And then this congregation, actually, the minister's wife, Margaret Kennedy, I don't know if you remember her or know her, she was a survivor of clergy sexual abuse. So I want to mention that in gratitude 30 years ago, that this congregation welcomed us. My reflection is actually going to be on something from the Gospel of Mark. Who touched me? This is a dramatic question. We ask it when we are unexpectedly touched by someone, and we do not know who has touched us. We don't know why we have been touched. 2,000 years ago, Jesus asked this very question. It's found in a remarkable story about him in the Gospel of Mark. For Christians, because Jesus poses this question, it's no longer an ordinary question. It's a sacred question. It is God's question. In Mark's story, Jesus is on an urgent mission of healing. Interestingly enough, of a child, a 12-year-old girl. She's very sick. He's walking with her father, who has sought Jesus out and begged him for help, even though his daughter's case is considered hopeless. So Jesus and the girl's father are rushing to her. And they're moving very swiftly. A crowd of the curious and the bored are following them and surrounding Jesus. People are elbowing and jostling each other to get a good look. We've all been in these kinds of crowds. I remember when I first went to Tokyo, taking the subway for the first time. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. I was pushed with a crowd of passengers from a platform through the doors of the train by a very polite subway workers who were holding these massive shields, and they were just pushing you in. Yet with all this, very politely, yet with all this pushing and shoving, Jesus suddenly stops because he has felt someone touch him. And because he stops, the crowd stops. And his urgent mission of healing, that stops too. And Jesus looks around him, he looks to his left and to his right, and then he turns around. And then he asks his question. Who touched me? That is the question that I have been asking my entire life since being raped and sexually assaulted as a boy by Father Gail Liefeld. Let us for a moment, if we can, be guided by the one who asked this question. Indeed, who, as it continues to be revealed, and it is ongoing globally, in the ongoing trauma of sexual abuse and of clergy and the cover-up of these crimes by bishops, cardinals, and popes. 3 of them, by the way, under my lifetime. 3 popes have covered this up in various ways. Who has touched the Church of Jesus? Because the touch of sexual violence has found a comfortable, and I don't like this, saying this, but it has found a comfortable and welcoming home in the Catholic priesthood for centuries, for a very long time. So the question of who has touched the Church of Jesus has become, and should be for many Christians and Catholics in particular, the most important question I think they should ask. It has brought on through the decades a crisis of faith, and it should be a crisis of faith. The disciples who were with Jesus, according to this gospel account, found his question really untimely and really unwanted. After all, they were on a very important assignment. They were amazed and astonished that Jesus was even asking such an absurd question. How in such a crowd would you possibly know who touched you when everyone's touching you? How often we survivors are told how untimely, unwanted, and impractical our question is concerning who touched us. How often we are told that it is interfering and even stopping the important work of the church. Yet Jesus, according to Mark, knew instantaneously that he had been touched. And upon being touched, he, quote, immediately felt the power going out of him. So much for power, which we seem to worship, of course, in this society. What's even more amazing is that Jesus has barely been touched. The gospel says the hem of his robe was just barely grazed. So, who is this person who touched Jesus? I cannot tell you her name because the gospel doesn't say, but it is a woman. And because we do not know her name, I like to think of her as Jane Doe. Now, why Jane Doe? Jane or John Doe, of course. John Doe, by the way, was a great movie. I'll throw that out. From the 40s. Jane Doe is, or John Doe is a generic stand-in for an unknown person. In particular, it's a placeholder, of course, for a legal case. And many of the criminal and civil cases, the thousands of them that have been filed against abusive clergy and their bishops and religious order provincials, are filed under Jane or John Doe to protect the identity of the victim. So we have here our 1st century Jane Doe. According to the gospel account, the woman who touched Jesus without his foreknowledge or his permission had been afflicted for 12 years with interminable bleeding. Biblical scholars suggest that she was suffering from a severe disorder in her menstrual cycle, which would have also rendered her ritually unclean in the religious society of her time. The gospel tells us that she had spent all her money seeking a cure and, quote, suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors. Can you imagine for a moment the isolation this woman in Mark 5 was experiencing? She was not allowed to touch anyone or anything for 12 years because whoever she touched would be considered unclean. She had a husband. She could not have sexual intercourse if she had children. She could not caress, love, or mother them. She was relegated to live without touch and affection. I believe that the woman in this gospel story is, in fact, a survivor of sexual abuse. And if we survivors of these crimes have, as they are called in my church, a patron saint, surely it is the nameless hero of this biblical story. Someone touched her in a way that shattered her body and silenced her voice. Indeed, sexual crimes burrow themselves into the mysterious border regions between the mind and the body, what Christians call the soul. Not surprisingly, menstruation is very commonly altered by this unique and terrible trauma. Our many basic and necessary bodily functions, like sleep and memory and appetite. I do not believe there is a single survivor who has undergone the destitution of sexual assault, female or male, child or adult, who will not instantaneously identify with her seemingly hopeless quest to find a cure for her affliction. In fact, after seeing so many doctors and specialists, she has gotten worse, according to the gospel, not better. That's not an uncommon outcome for survivors under the care of doctors and specialists. Undoubtedly, like a lot of victims, she has lost family and friends. She's unable to maybe work, cannot have close relationships. She suffers from persistent and unwanted nightmares and flashbacks. No doubt she is at times suicidal. And unfortunately, I know many, many victims who have taken their lives over the years. Most of all, we can surmise she's unable to touch or be touched in any meaningful way by another human being. But she persists. She does not give way on her desire to be healed. And she risks reaching for this healing, for the divine, because she knows that although her affliction is physical, its true source is spiritual. In Christianity, God became fully a human being, not partially or under a disguise. God fell into his own creation, or maybe slipped. Unlike other religions of the ancient world, God did not appear to assume the form of a human being. He became a human being, and he had a body just like yours and just like mine. In becoming human, for Christians at least, God forever changed the meaning of touch, turning every act of touch into a potential act of truth. Touching, as the gospel shows us again and again, has both its divine and demonic manifestations. And this is especially and undeniably true when the touch is sexual. It's an endless mystery that the shame the sex offender should logically and naturally feel within his own conscience or soul while violating the body of another person, especially a child, is rarely felt by him. Instead, the shame of this crime, this awful and crushing weight, is poured into the body of the victim. This is why the victim, not the offender, most often feels like the criminal. And it is why it is so difficult for most survivors to come forward. The sexual offender always commits two crimes. First, he steals the body, and then he steals the voice. You can hear the impact of this theft. Whenever we survivors talk about what happened to us and how we reach for words we know will be inadequate to the violation, and how our speech is so often arrested by moments of mute remembrance. Needless to say, too often, still, when victims do speak up with their halting and barely audible voices struggling to be heard and restored, they are unwelcome and unwanted. the perpetrator is almost always of greater social value than the victim. So it is the victim who will be charged, if not by words, then by actions, with violating the peace and the order of the family, or the community, or the church. Indeed, there are so many psychological and social forces arrayed against a victim speaking, especially a child, that when it does occur, it is almost always a miracle. A greater miracle, one might say, than even walking on water. Catholics sometimes say to me, defiantly, like all groups are often, proud of themselves. This scandal has not made me lose my faith. My reply to this is, it is wonderful that you have succeeded where Christ failed. There's a famous book by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell called Why I Am Not a Christian. It's a good book. Let me tell you why I am still a Christian. It's because losing one's faith is not a problem in Christianity. Christ, my brother, our brother, utterly and totally lost his faith. He cried this loss of faith on the cross. Every child abused by anyone, every child abused by a priest, makes this exact same cry. And I would say this loss of faith is one's entry into Christianity. Simone Weil, the great and challenging 20th century French philosopher who was part of the French Resistance, once wrote, "At the bottom of the heart of every human being, from the earliest infancy until the tomb, there is something that goes on indomitably expecting in the teeth of all experience of crimes committed, suffered, and witnessed, that good and not evil will be done to him. It is this above all that is sacred in every human being." How I remember, as so many survivors do, while being molested by Father Liefeld, the crucifix on the wall of his room. St. Paul taught us that the greatest things in this universe are faith, hope, and love. Faith is indeed great, but it's not the greatest thing. Hope is great, but it's not the greatest thing. Christ lost his faith and his hope, but not his love. Love is the greatest of all things. And the crisis of sexual abuse by clergy is, and make no mistake about this, not really a crisis of faith and hope. It's a crisis of love. God so ordered the world that he placed at the center of the human heart the free faculty of consent, of the consent to love. Sexual abuse is a parody and mockery of that consent. That so many bishops and so many cardinals don't get this is absolutely astonishing. From the religion of love, from the religion that's based entirely on love. The church believes that God created us so that we might long through love for the absolute good. This longing is sacred. Only the divine can satisfy it. It forms a link between each person and God. This link exists in every human being, whatever their character, history, or circumstances. And this includes every sex offender on this planet. It is the means by which the good enters into every human life. But this good, which the church says is essential to human salvation, cannot enter a person without a free act of consent. The human consent to the divine initiative of love can never, ever, under any circumstances, be coerced, manipulated, or forced. It can never result from the operation of any kind of human or natural necessity whatsoever, physical, psychological, or social. I was taught as a small boy on my mother's knee, as many of us were, the Lord's Prayer. It begins, of course, with the phrase, "Our Father who is in heaven." God, Jesus instructs us, is absent from the earth. He's nowhere to be found on the earth. Where gravity, not grace, as Wade talks about, so often reigns. So the prayer implies it's truly pointless to look for him here. When Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, they mistook him for the gardener. And he said to them, "What you are seeking for is not here." Maybe this is why God absurdly surrendered his eternal place of peace. How much effort and time, especially in our capitalist industry of psychology, et cetera, are we spending trying to find peace and homeostasis and wholeness? That's exactly the place God left. He left that place of eternal peace so that he might touch and be touched by his creation. Maybe he paid this price so that he might join us in a never-ending wonderment and sorrow at the Father's absence. Our bodies are the site of a great drama, where God and humanity meet, argue, pray. God brings gravity's opposite, which is grace. It's grace that fills the cursed body of the woman of the gospel story and fires her up with courage and boldness and fearlessness, in spite of the self-blame, self-hatred, and self-accusation that sexual affliction brings and seems to permanently establish in so many of us. Grace plots to bring us close to the Jesus who lost his faith and hope in God. It is grace that moves us from him to us and back again. And when grace moves back and forth between the creation and the creator, and when we switch places for a moment, maybe just for a split second, the inexorable and seemingly unbreakable law of gravity is really and truly suspended. As Mark reports concerning our nameless hero, our Saint Jane Doe, that when she touched Jesus, and this is my final words, my hope after all these years for myself and for survivors of sexual abuse everywhere, that there'll be one collective moment where gravity will be suspended, the gravity of everyday life, of our economic and political and religious systems, blah, 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 blah. For one moment, it'll be suspended for all of us. And like that woman in the gospel story, the terrible suffering will be lifted from our bodies. Well, thank you Thank you for letting me talk about this. And I want to introduce here Sarah Pearson, who's the Deputy Director of Nate's Mission, which is the statewide clergy sexual abuse, anti-sexual abuse organization. And we're going to now totally change the subject. We're going to show a short video about what's going on here in Wisconsin with this issue. We're going to get real concrete with this, and then we'll take, I think, some questions, if that's okay. Sarah?
Thank you, everyone, for having us. I really don't have a lot to say before we show the video, because I think, that'll do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of describing what's going on in the state right now and some of our advocacy work related to clergy abuse. So we're kind of switching over to, how we've been working with the state now to address some of these issues. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and then maybe we'll talk more about it afterwards. I think. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Matt Flynn, and I'm running for governor of Wisconsin. So I want to say a little bit about myself and why I'm running.
Who is Matt Flynn? He was the head of the Wisconsin Democratic Party in the 1980s. He's an amateur author.
I've written political satire partially in Milwaukee and Washington. The Chinese come in to try to kidnap the math genius, and they get beaten back with the whole city of Milwaukee.
But most importantly, he was chief legal counsel for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee at the height of their sexual abuse and cover-up crisis. At one point, a frontrunner in the race, it was entirely possible that one of the architects of the Archdiocesan strategy to keep abusive priests in ministry could have become Wisconsin's governor. During the campaign, Flynn often downplayed his role, comparing himself to a public defender, portraying himself as this heroic figure who swept in to rid the church of pedophiles and restore its reputation.
I came in to clean it up. And what happened was we cleaned it up. We've represented the Archdiocese of Milwaukee for more than 50 years. When these cases came along, our job was to clean it up.
Anyone who was around in this time period could tell you this was a lie. If you weren't around, a Google search will tell you this was a lie. Flynn was known for his legendary cruelty towards survivors and his scorched earth approach towards any person who filed a lawsuit against the church.
In short, he used the legal system as a tool to bully me. The wounds were still very fresh, and he took full advantage of that.
In 1995, he successfully argued a case before the Wisconsin Supreme Court that barred any lawsuit against the church for negligent supervision, making suing the church something that was already extremely difficult to do, nearly impossible.
That decision affected not just my case and the others that were before the court that day, but decades of cases for survivors. And no viable means for them to obtain justice. That is truly Matt Flynn's legacy, the protection of pedophiles at the cost of children.
During Flynn's tenure with the Archdiocese, at least 23 abusive priests were transferred, and those are just the ones that were publicly identified by the church. Flynn worked closely with Archbishop Robert Wheatland and Milwaukee County District Attorney E. Michael McCann to shield the church from accountability and conceal the abuse from the public. We showed up at one of his campaign events with church documents that demonstrated his role in facilitating secret payments to abusive priests to leave the ministry quietly, without notifying the public.
If we had a statement for me, it might be published, it might be online, registry.
Okay, but I don't understand how you can say that this is not true. Excuse me? Because the document is right here, like it shows the abuse, it shows the payment, and it shows a letter from you describing the payment.
I guess what I'll say is, when you look at our response, if it was satisfied.
Well, I don't understand why you're giving me a response right now.
Thank you.
The next day, he did give a response.
Jump in the lake, I mean.
So the Jump in the Lake challenge was born. Once a frontrunner in the race, Flynn finished close to last in a crowded primary. In the process of the campaign, we got nearly every candidate for governor to release a statement in support of the Child Victims Act. His campaign was over, but ours was not. With Matt Flynn out of the governor's race, we turned our attention to the Wisconsin Department of Justice. Then Attorney General Brad Schimmel was making headlines for his administration's backlog of over 4,000 untested rape kits. At a debate, AG Schimmel and then candidate Josh Paul were asked about a potential investigation into clergy sexual abuse.
I don't indict by headline, and I think with some of those who are talking about what they're investigating, they're indicting people by headline. I don't do that. I also have great appreciation for the need to not use the power of a prosecutor to destroy people's lives if you don't have the evidence to make that case.
If there are credible allegations that have been brought forward that there is misconduct that needs to be investigated and could potentially be prosecuted in Wisconsin, that is something that the AG's office should take a look at.
A short time later, we met Schimmel outside of an event to hand deliver a letter from survivors asking for a commitment to investigate the church for abuse and cover-up.
Yeah, we were working with them. I hope we'll bring those cases to the attention of all the enforcement entities.
Right, we're already talking about, how we exactly looked at it, all these efforts. I know, it's been so many years. So this is, those documents have been there for several years. I know. So did you see how, as files, how bishops covered it up? So how Wheatland and Bishop Skelma, Bishop Skelma, I don't know if you've seen this document, he actually says in there, he writes in there, that returning priests and ministry is an experiment. That is their experiment. I mean, that's shocking. That's stunning. Think about it. A lot of human beings.
But Mr. Attorney General, when you were asked about this during the debate, why did you give survivors confidence by letting them know that was something that you were going to address, and why won't you listen to us? Why is that not something that you're willing to publicly address? Why won't you answer our questions?
Less than a month later, he lost his bid for re-election to Wisconsin's current Attorney General, Josh Paul. We had hoped that our new Attorney General would take a different approach towards the Catholic Church in Wisconsin.
Let's get to work. Thank you so much.
For more than 30 years, survivors have pleaded for an investigation into the Catholic Church's role in perpetuating the sexual abuse of children in Wisconsin.
We are urging and we need the Wisconsin Attorney General to finally begin to investigate and review the evidence and the criminal activity that has been taking place.
On March 5th of 2020, we met with Attorney General Paul and District Attorney John Chisholm to discuss the possibility of a statewide investigation. Paul told us he needed a political reason to investigate the church. Just 4 days later, Nate Lindstrom died by suicide. As a teenager, Nate was sexually assaulted by normative priests at Notre Dame Academy in De Pere, Wisconsin.
As a youth, you think that they would do something at some point, that they would help, but they never did. They were only interested in attacking us.
Because there were no available avenues to justice through the court system, Nate was forced to seek help from the Norbertines, the organization whose priests and administrators groomed him, abused him, and intimidated him into silence. After the church cut off payments for Nate's mental health treatment, he took his life.
It's up to us to carry on Nate's mission. Don't let it happen to your kid, your brother, or the neighbor kid.
His death galvanized alumni of Notre Dame Academy to demand transparency and accountability from the church and intervention from the Wisconsin Department of Justice. When Call's office finally agreed to open an investigation, we were cautiously optimistic.
And I'll use this word very deliberately when you're requesting.
We were clear that the investigation needed to focus on the church as a nonprofit corporation and examine patterns and practices that facilitated sexual abuse.
We can't just prosecute a few individuals and believe that this problem is going to go away.
We brought them our expertise on the history of this issue, everything we had learned through our network of survivors throughout the country, and most importantly, our commitment to justice and truth-telling, a commitment that we wanted to believe the Wisconsin Department of Justice shared. In April of 2021, Call made the official announcement that he was opening a statewide investigation into clergy abuse. Standing with him were 5 district attorneys from every county in Wisconsin in which a Catholic diocese is located. Call promised to follow the evidence wherever it leads.
I want to stress that we strongly encourage anyone who knows anything to report. No detail is too small.
He asked for any and all information related to clergy abuse or church cover-up. Having dealt with Wisconsin's bishops and their corporate lawyers, we knew they weren't going to hand it over without a fight. A little over a month after the announcement, Wisconsin's Catholic bishops, led by Archbishop Jerome Listecki of Milwaukee, announced that they intended to obstruct Call's investigation by refusing to share documents and evidence with the DOJ. In a letter to the Attorney General, they characterized Call's investigation as an act of anti-Catholic bigotry. We were under the impression that the DOJ and the 5 district attorneys, including Milwaukee County District Attorney John Chisholm, would push back. We were wrong. To this date, no law enforcement official in Wisconsin has made any apparent effort to enforce compliance with the investigation, even though they acknowledged to us that they were aware that the church was withholding information about priests, nuns, Catholic teachers, and lay people who had abused children. 4 of Wisconsin's 5 Catholic dioceses have published lists of abusive clergy, but the lists are incomplete. The Wisconsin DOJ led us to believe this was a priority in the investigation.
So to make sure the lists are accurate is the first project.
Having the public acknowledge that this is validated, this is something that happened, it's something that is really significant to all the survivors, and that makes a big difference for them. And but those lists are they're not accurate, just like that.
Church lists do not address patterns of racial discrimination in their treatment of victims and the disproportionate number of known abusers transferred into predominantly Black parishes and schools.
African Americans come to this issue with a pre-existing condition. That pre-existing condition is the trauma of racism. And then added to that, you have the trauma of the abuse. And then added to that, you have the trauma of being called a liar.
Priests like Father Michael Newberger specifically targeted communities of color.
At Milwaukee's federal courthouse today, we learned that a lawsuit is being filed on behalf of Raphael Love, a Black clergy abuse victim. Advocates say Love was abused by Brother Paul West. It happened decades ago at a school in Mississippi that was operated by a religious order based here in the Milwaukee area. But these advocates argue that race and economic status affect how abuse victims are treated.
My name is Joshua Kendrell Love. I was born 1983. I was 10, 11, and 12 when I was molested by a friar at St. Francis of Assisi. I have a thinking chair, and I fell in love with the chair because it makes me feel like I'm still happy because it's a school chair. And I've been hurt by wanting to learn to go to school, and it just made me feel like It's gonna be all right. I'll be all right. It's make me strong, like, I guess the child inside me just still wants to sit there, like.
A civil lawsuit has been filed against the Franciscans of the Blessed Virgin Mary this week, alleging a pattern of racial discrimination in the treatment of survivors and placement of offenders. Call says this is not part of the inquiry.
Milwaukee in some areas and in other parts of the state, there are certain perpetrators who would talk about specifically targeting children by race or abuse. We think that we're missing a big part of the picture. We don't hear from them. Especially, I mean, I think of the Native community in Green Bay and Superior area.
But you know, we work pretty closely with the tribes, and so definitely we would want to reach out.
All the indigenous people and the people of color, you know, that are in the inner cities that had priests and nuns that blessed them, you know, listen to these stories that are out there. We were forced, you know, this religion. They forced it upon us to support us.
People buried in the grave sites. There doesn't seem to be any documentation about how these people died.
And the people who really know about it and are responsible about it and have the records in the archives about it are the Catholic Church, the Diocese of Green Bay, for instance.
Attorney General Josh Call is already investigating abuse within several Catholic dioceses in Wisconsin. Yet organizers of today's walk are urging Call to expand that investigation to include the schools Native American children were forced to attend.
Contact the Wisconsin DOJ to inform them that I was in possession of an internal church list with the names of hundreds of priests and other faculty members and volunteers who had been accused of sexually assaulting children in Milwaukee Archdiocese. The person on the phone told me that this sounded extremely important and that she would contact her superiors to figure out what I should do with the list. They never returned my call.
How do you ensure the lists are accurate with no documents or evidence? Because whistleblowers could not get through to the AG, they gave the documents to us. We delivered thousands of pages of documents and evidence to the TOJ. This included secret church lists of priests, coaches, choir directors, teachers, nuns, and volunteers who had been accused of abusing children in the Milwaukee Archdiocese and the Green Bay Diocese. There were hundreds of names on the list that are not included in the list published by the church. These were not all historical cases as the church alleged. Many of the individuals on this list appear to still be in ministry, some in positions working with children. Additionally, we brought the list to Milwaukee County District Attorney John Chisholm and Brown County District Attorney David Lizay.
You all get the secret list, you can grab the evidence of collusion shredding on top of the fire. Yeah.
Church whistleblowers around the state have been obtaining this, finding this, getting it to us, getting it to survivors, to get to law enforcement, because they're concerned, hey, what's happening with this?
Nate's mission dropped off documents, including the list to Brown County District Attorney David Lizay this afternoon. It also included evidence of the diocese shredding documents in 2007.
Dropped off the documents here at the district attorney's office while we're giving our press conference. Someone pointed out that he was escaping through the elevator behind us. Wearing a gray suit. Really all I saw.
We had hoped that AG Call or any of the other district attorneys supporting the investigation would act on the whistleblower information. We had asked them time and time again to use the power of their collective offices to subpoena documents and evidence and compel testimony of church officials. Instead, the AG's office turned over a significant portion of the whistleblower documents to the Archdiocese of Milwaukee's Chief Legal Counsel, Frank McCullough, putting whistleblowers at risk. On a call about the whistleblower documents, Assistant AG Elliot Held explained his reluctance to engage with the church on this issue.
You're talking about very aggressive attorneys on the other side. We have a very politically charged Supreme Court in the state, and I'm not touching that, but it's something that the type of.
This was a devastating development in our efforts, and we believe survivors were owed an honest assessment from us regarding Attorney General Paul's performance in the investigation. We held a press conference at the Wisconsin State Capitol to assess Attorney General Paul's investigation. We presented a report card to the AG that included grades for several areas of his investigation.
I submitted it to the Wisconsin Department of Justice. I talked to them. I sent multiple emails back and forth. Then around March, I finally emailed and I said, what is being done? This was promised to be an investigation into clergy abuse, right? I asked them, what is being done? They said, point blank, and I have the email, they said, maybe investigation is too strong of a word. And they said, we don't have the money.
Last year, the DOJ was clear that lack of funding would not impede their investigation.
Right now, it's not like we need to find money or we're not going to be able to do this. Okay. We are convinced that we have the funds available to do this the right way.
Yeah, we'll put it this way, our participation was secured under the understanding that this was an investigation. It involved some effort to retrieve documents and evidence and produce accurate lists, and that has not been the experience of what has become.
If you do one thing, but you're gonna not do 5 things, and you're gonna make me think you're gonna do those 5 things, you're leading us to believe you're gonna do those 5 things, and that is the effect of a lie, by the way. And I gotta tell you, you don't do that to victims of child rape.
Ron Johnson knows that the way to revitalize our economy is to get Washington out of the way. Policies that lower taxes, allowing Wisconsin to vote Ron Johnson for senator.
You know, my wife, what did you do after 6 months of doing this?
We did not
know,
approve of this message.
She says, I'm like,
Yeah. All right. Those fellas. Perfect. Thank you. Well, folks, you that have stayed, and it's a lot of stuff, right? Hey, I just want to let you know personally, Sarah can talk what she thinks. I mean, the Attorney General, it's just been incredibly difficult, but I'm still going to vote for call. So just to let you know, that's how bad I think this situation is politically in our country right now. So I just want you to say that, you know what I mean? But it's been, we'll see what questions you guys see since you're back there. Yeah.
I voted for call in this election, but with the video, I was confused. Is he okay? Because I know Chisholm is trash. We should have got the black lady in there last time. We didn't vote for her. The lady, she ended up leaving the state, but Chisholm is trash. So is the call all right? I don't know. I'm asking. It was confusing to me.
It's confusing to us. Yeah, did you want to ask that?
I just want to say, I think that as a
501c, the Unitarian Church, I don't think it's appropriate to talk about candidates.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we should or shouldn't, whatever you're saying not to, so we're not going to, but and it's there, I'd like to get a chance over this. Sexual violence is a political issue. It's a political issue, especially when it involves organizations and professionals. It's one thing to commit crimes, it's all bad. To commit sexual assault, but you commit sexual assault in the commission of your professional occupation, working with children and families, that's another thing altogether. And when you have a major social organization where it has been demonstrated and proved that they have systematically covered up these crimes, that needs a political response. And so, you know, we're the last people. I like Cole. I mean, I'm not talking politically. I like him as a person. I know John quite well, actually. The point is like religion, this separation supposedly between church and state. I think that's a binary that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because I'll just be point blank with you. I mean, when Call announced this investigation and told us it was going to be an investigation, those 5 district attorneys, that was fine for us to be there then. That was fine for us to talk about it and be the front of that for them. You know, then it's okay. But we feel an obligation to say what has happened. When he did that, the Catholic diocese, the bishops of the state, led by Archbishop Wostecki, now think about this for a moment. They publicly said and announced and wrote to him, made a big deal out of this. We're not going to cooperate. Okay, so you have an organization that will not cooperate with the child abuse investigation. Okay? A religion or organization that won't do it. Because they, in part, they are. The Catholic Church is part of the conservative right-wing movement. I don't know how else to say it. I'm sorry. They have been bought by they're part of the right-wing parties, you know, of the Republican Party, basically. So that's just a fact. And so my point is that neither Democrats, you know, Matt Flynn was a Democrat. You know, Ron Johnson was involved in Green Bay. He was on the Finance Council in Green Bay when they shredded documents. Under canon law, he would have had to have approved that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I want to know what you're going to do about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what I can say is that, like, you know, we can't advocate for or against any political candidate. Our job is to tell the truth about what's happening.
What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm going to get there. But I mean, what's happening is, you know, you see in the video, this is what we're doing about it. But, you know, it's like whether it's Colin Office or somebody else, you know, we have an ethical obligation to uphold the truth. And that means, you know, trying to see justice through for these survivors. So we're, you know, we're gonna keep going at it because there's a standard that we believe should be met by the state of Wisconsin, you know, no matter who's in charge. And that's that organizations who harbor abusers and allow this to continue to happen over and over again need to be held accountable. And, you know, it applies to both sides, as you can see in the video. You know, it's not isolated to one side of the one party or one side of the debate. And, you know, that's, it's really devastating. But it's our responsibility to keep advocating for that no matter what. So, I mean, that's why we brought those lists to the AG's office, because one of the things that we are concerned about is that the church was holding on to these lists that contain the names of hundreds of offenders, and many of them appear to still be in ministry in positions where they can still harm children. So what we're doing, that's why we took those lists there, and we're so adamant about it being reviewed and investigated, is because we know that there are still children who could potentially be, you know, under threat because of the people who are on those lists. So, I mean, that's why we're continuing this advocacy with the state, because this list, it came from church whistleblowers. So the church is holding on to this. They know those people have allegations against them and they haven't removed them. And we're very concerned with that knowledge, you know, that people could continually be harmed. And that's something that's a pattern that we've seen across, you know, the entire world. I mean, it's been happening in the United States, but unfortunately, because of the lack of accountability from any of these government organizations, you know, there are high profile instances in which people with allegations against them are just being put back into ministry. And there's a big one in Chicago came out about Father Flagger, you know, who is, you know, a major hero of many people for his role in civil rights movements throughout the year, but he, you know, harmed so many people. And, you know, that we're concerned that things like that are going on, and we know that there are. There was a huge case in the Congo about a priest who raped and abused a 16-year-old girl who was put in ministry and, you know, was not held accountable for that. So unfortunately, like what we've seen is that the church is not going to police itself. They're not going to remove these people on their own accord. And unfortunately, the experience that we've had is that we haven't had a lot of luck with state officials doing that either, you know, without our intervention. So our role as advocates and people who want to protect children, you know, who want to make the church an abuse-free and safe place, you know, that we have to be calling that out wherever we see it and try to hold, you know, both the church and state officials accountable, you know, to making sure that every child has the right, you know, to practice their faith free of persecution. And that's, you know, why we're doing this. And, you know, I don't think it's not fun to be in an adversarial position, you know, with the government. You know, it's the, you know, like taking these lists there, you know, I don't like being a nuisance. I don't like being a problem. You know, I don't want to be in a fight with the DA or the Attorney General. It's, you know, it's not fun at all. And, you know, we took, you know, absolutely no pleasure in doing this. You know, it was actually very heartbreaking for us to have, especially, you know, for people like Peter, who for 30 years have been advocating for an investigation of that sort. And then for one to open up and to have this be the result. But, you know, the reason that we're still doing this is because, you know, maybe stupidly, we still have hope, and we still, you know, believe that there's a right and a wrong here, and that those need to be corrected. And, you know, that's why we go on.
Are there organizations just as yours in other states?
Well, you know, I wish there were more of them, but, you know, I think we actually, the first time we showed this video, we showed it at the SNAP conference, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. And, you know, there were probably dozens and dozens of survivors in the audience, and a lot of people attended a panel afterwards, and they were asking questions, you know, how could I do something like this in my state? You know, what can I do? And we were trying to give them tools, you know, maybe can you, like, if you're holding a meeting, could you, you know, do you have lists? You know, could you show up at the office? And trying to give people techniques for, you know, how you can engage in those types of things, and like strategies and tactics that you could use, because this is unfortunately, and I'll kind of zoom out here, you know, what's happening in Wisconsin is just an example of what's happening everywhere in the country. And one of our great fears is this, you know, for decades, you know, since this has, you know, been widespread and publicly known, survivors have been demanding these investigations. People may be familiar with Pennsylvania. In 2018, there was a landmark grand jury report, you know, that named hundreds of abusers and thousands of victims. And that really set off a chain of these state investigations. But the thing that we're concerned about is, you know, what happens when an investigation like this wraps up, and, you know, all they've done is potentially add a few names to the list, but it hasn't structurally changed, you know, the mechanisms that allow this abuse to continue, you know, for so many years in all of these states. And, you know, Wisconsin, this is tough to say, because, you know, we've seen how this organization or this investigation sort of failed us, is that, you know, it's probably a lot better than other investigations. You know, you had states like Florida that their investigations consisted of the AG coming out and making an announcement and said, we didn't find anything, and it wrapped up. So what happens then is that afterwards, you know, anytime we bring something to light, you know, I think the response often from, you know, the institutional church might be, well, wasn't this investigated? And we would have to say, well, no, as a matter of fact, it wasn't. And it makes it's, you know, a lot tougher for us. And that's a really common tactic that is used as like, we're gonna open an investigation. The investigation doesn't do anything, it closes, people move on, and then people who don't really know, you know, maybe aren't as in touch with this issue or aren't as in tune with what's happening, you know, kind of assume, well, I guess somebody's handled it. And we don't want that to happen here because it needs to be handled. Okay, go ahead.
I just want to say I applaud your efforts, and I know how difficult it is to come up against, say, the social capital of the Catholic Church, in particular in this city. And I wonder, I agree with you, it's a political issue and it needs exposure. And exposure is how you will win.
That's true.
So I'm wondering if there are other groups with whom you could coalesce and expand your reach. Are there groups that you are in coalition?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just tell you, this sucks.
Yeah.
And it just comes down to the fact that churches and religions and whatever they represent are just simply so much more important. And not just to conservatives. I mean, I knew Wakeland, he was a big liberal. And then he was followed by a big conservative. When it comes to this issue, all the other stuff, whatever, but when it comes to drill down to this issue, they were exactly the same. And now I was devastated by that because I'm someone on the left. You know, it's the same with the Attorney General. I mean, it's like, you saw how complicated this is. If you want to get rid of something, just make it complicated. You have the power to just make it complicated. You just delay it and take it off people's attentions about 1 minute. I mean, this thing about coalitions, if you're going to take on this thing, nobody wants to take on this thing. They agree with it and everything, but they don't want to take it on. I can't tell you, when I started this 30 years ago, sexual assault organizations, you know, working with that, they didn't want to touch us, be with us. They, you know, it's always, yeah, we're with you, but they did because of funding, because of, you know, how this kind of how it looks. It took like 15 years before they could like even, and that's our natural allies, right? You know, because it's like, you know, why take the risk? You know, and then we can do it. You know, it all falls on victims. It always falls on us. You know, it's like, why does it always fall on us? And when you have an advocate, like law enforcement, you want an advocate of law enforcement, yes, John Chisholm and his predecessor, Mike McCann, it's unbelievable. Do you think I like saying these things? And it's all demonstrated. I mean, these whistleblowers, I'll just try to be, it's shocking. These documents, these are internal church files that show, that indicate that in this archdiocese and in Green Bay, the Diocese of Green Bay, just take the Archdiocese of Green Bay, just listen to this for a second. Their own list of those that have been alleged to have abused children over the past decades is like 260. Their official list, which they use as their, we've done it, we've got it out there, which hasn't changed, by the way, since they were forced to get it out, for political reasons, by the way. But I mean, it's like, okay, that was like 15 years ago. It's 48. It's 48. So they're saying that all these other allegations, every one of them is false. Because who gets to investigate them if it's outside of the statute of limitations, which traditionally was like 6 years. So if you're 5 years old, you better come forward for your 11 or some nonsense. So who gets to investigate them? Who does the court allow? Who does the district attorney? Who does the attorney general allow to investigate them? Themselves. And so, wow, they're passing with flying colors. They get to submit their own, they get to change the test. You know, it's like they can change the test and wow, A+. And then they can say it's because of an attack on Catholicism, that in investigating child, I just told you 200 some names. Gee, maybe we ought to look at what's going on here. Gee, maybe that would be okay to do that when you've got tens of thousands of files, okay, that we haven't seen. So it's like, all right, that's an attack on religion. That's what they said. They said that is a violation of free speech in the First Amendment. We will not cooperate. And you say that's not a political stance? That's not a political stance. And so, yes, we expected that, you know, people were gonna, who were, this was directed towards, our law enforcement officials, were gonna stand up and say, that's not acceptable. That is not acceptable, and push back on that claim. They haven't. And that, see what I'm saying? It's like, that's how important, because it's like, no one wants to touch this third rail. And it's gonna be like, well, we'll take care of victims. We'll be nice to them, you know, now you can take care of whatever, you know, we'll just like, it's like those lists. How can the Attorney General validate those lists if they're not giving them files, if he can't get their evidence? How can he do it? He can't do it. He simply cannot do it. But you can say, well, you know, it happened, you know, and we'll refer them on to therapists that they have to pay for. And you cannot solve, sorry, it's a word, it's like you cannot solve social and political problems with psychotherapy. That is neoliberalism. You know, it's like we're going to solve everything with like, oh, psychotherapy, it's your fault. You made the wrong choice, whatever. And he literally says that, if you heard that, you know, it's like, well, you know, it's important for victims to know. It's like this is our like thing, you know what I mean? Like, it's not your thing, it's like everybody's thing, you know.
Is there an organization of the victims that are willing to finally stand up and come forward and
yeah, we've been doing that for 30 years, including around the world. Yeah.
I mean, the organization that, you know, the two of us have been affiliated with is called Ending Clergy Abuse, and it's actually an international organization.
Okay.
So it's in, you know, 29 countries and 6 continents, and, you know, we're actually closely affiliated. We work with people from Chile and Argentina and Mexico and Guatemala and the Congo and, you know, where else, Poland and France and Germany. And so, I mean, we're in Canada, we're pretty much everywhere. So, I mean, one of the things we've been trying to do, and, you know, maybe this is a lot of information that we've given to you today, but, you know, because the Vatican is a sovereign state and you have to go through certain diplomatic means to be able to get things, Pope Francis in 2019 announced that he was lifting papal secrecy. So technically, you know, Archbishop Listecki isn't just, you know, violating, you know, Josh Paul asking him for these documents, he's also violating, you know, the church's decree that they should be openly sharing these. So one of the things we've been trying to do in coalition with these other groups is, you know, demand, you know, a zero tolerance, like a real zero tolerance response, that any, you know, any cleric who's abusing children should be immediately removed from ministry, and to actually lift papal secrecy, not just, you know, in theory or in word, but to actually, you know, open themselves up, be totally transparent. You know, if a state investigation is underway and they ask for these documents, that they give them to them, you know, without reservation, so that, you know, the actual patterns and practices could be determined. I mean, in Milwaukee, it's like, you know, like what we've seen is some of these people may still be in ministry, and some of them, you know, are passed on, but there's still, you know, value to determining, you know, how this was able to happen and what happened. And I can give an example of another state. You know, New York maybe had a more aggressive attorney general in terms of their dealings with the church. And Letitia James actually sued the Diocese of Buffalo and said, you know, you need to prove to us that you've been in compliance with your own standards in terms of child safety. So we need to see this. So that's the kind of response that we were looking for, is to say, okay, you know, because they had, you know, in 2002, when everything Spotlight, if you've seen the movie, it all kind of blew up. And, you know, they instituted this new charter that they're supposed to be following, you know, certain rules on how they would deal with this. And, you know, our fear from what we've seen is that we know, okay, it doesn't look like they're in compliance with this. And, you know, that's what the New York Attorney General is doing. So there are other groups, you know, like SNAP or like ECA, you know, that we're affiliated with. And, you know, ECA is, you know, sort of an umbrella organization for all these global organizations. Like, there are groups that have their own names, you know, in all these different countries who are doing similar work to us. So we can share information, you learn from each other. And one of the things that we're trying to do is, you know, get to the Vatican to take a trip there, because, you know, Pope Francis is doing this big synod in 2023. And I think they want to put the abuse issue behind them and pretend like it's no longer occurring. And, you know, so we want to make sure that we're there to say, no, this hasn't been resolved. It's still going on. we're not gonna forget about it, you can't forget about us, and like, we're not just gonna, shut up and go away and allow this to continue to proceed. And it looks like we're getting ready to wrap up, but we can
Yeah,
take
there's one more question.
one more.
No,
you
that's
know.
what I wanted to know.
Sure.
It's
not, why are you guys leaving?
Yeah, what happened when you appeared with those boxes?
Well, yeah, I mean, we would like to know the same thing, so.
Did you leave them or?
Well, unfortunately, yeah, we left them with them, and, we explained, it's something that we, for our own safety, like, can't just like publish it in the paper, because
That seems like the
it
best.
came from whistleblowers.
They won't.
But I mean, it's, our thing was, we wanted to do this publicly and, have it filmed and call a press conference, but the general public would know, just so you know, your district attorney and your attorney general are in possession of this, and they have it, so that's why we did a press conference, so that, the public would be aware that it's not like, they didn't have the information.
What I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that there's imminent risk, that there's abuse occurring.
Yeah.
So it seems like it would be the best result to release the information.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, it needs to be investigated.
Agreed. But
So,
it's not being,
right, but the thing is like, I will not, I've done this 30 years. There's a standard you have to reach to get into the public space, to publicly say something. I know that doesn't matter anymore, because people can say whatever the hell they want, make accusations against anybody. When you accuse someone of sexual assault or covering up child sexual assault, you better be absolutely damn sure you know what you're talking about. Because although it's extremely rare to have false allegations, it happens. So I know people, or I know they're abused, whatever, I'm very sure they are, but I can't publicly say that, because it has to be a standard of public proof. And that's exactly why the Attorney General and law enforcement is so important. That's why professional occupations have boards, okay, that are supposed to investigate anyone that's committed this sort of act. If they're a therapist or a psychologist or whatever, doesn't matter when it happened, their license is taken from them and they're put on a state registry. Okay, so they can't go around saying, well, okay, that's what has to be done. That's the mechanism that is not there. There's this sort of ersatz fake mechanism. The churches that, the archdiocese, I'm not telling you, they got so much money. They got 1 million of PR spinners. They got all these consultants and all this sort of corporatizing nonsense bullshit. And it's simply, I don't know what to say, it's bullshit. But that's what happens in our society. That's like, it's not like unusual, right? It's not like other people aren't doing this. This just happens to be, done under the auspices of God. The creator of the universe is authorizing this. I mean, the bottom line, I'll just leave with this, about how this system, and historically, it's amazing. The first documents about this go back to the 3rd century. 3rd century. I mean, it's people say, well, it's not fair to point out the, whatever. The percentage among clergy, and especially among Catholic clergy, is significantly higher than other occupations, significantly higher. That's a fact. I'm not making that up. There is something on this issue, I'll tell you, the way it's designed, everything wrong with the Catholic Church. I'm going to say it. Oh my God. Yes, there's something wrong. And a lot of people who know there's been something wrong with it, Catholics.
Yeah.
They know there's something wrong with it.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, exactly, in exile. But, but then we can't do anything unless Father tells us. It's like this, the enjoyment, maybe unconscious, the satisfaction in obeying. Okay, there's a satisfaction in that. Even if you think you're being so independent, like the conservatives now think they are. We're the bad boys, we're the transgressors, okay? Because they've taken that over apparently from the left. It's amazing. They have all the enjoyments politically. The left is terrible. We're bereft of enjoyment and satisfaction. But I'll just say this, I always ask, I asked this of Cardinal Dolan, I asked this of every cardinal I've met. I haven't met the Pope yet. I'll ask him this question. Okay, about this system, if I get right to it, okay? You can't be a woman and a priest. I'll accept that for a moment. You cannot be a married man and a priest. Okay, I'll accept that for a moment. But under their rules globally right now, you can be a child molester and a priest. And if you can explain that to me, okay, not one of them have been able to do it. Explain this rule to me, because whatever, if you create a world in which that statement's true, what I just said. Okay, it's a little philosophical exercise. Create a world in which that statement's true. There you have the clerical world, right there, right there. And it is a foundational position of it. No, most of them do not abuse children, but I can guarantee you, most of them know somebody that has.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.